Welcome, everyone. I'm Stacey Davis, Acting Director of the School of Music at University of Texas at San Antonio. Honored to introduce my colleague, Dr. Nicole Cherry, who's going to give us a wonderful lecture recital on the music of George Bridgetower. So please welcome Dr. Cherry.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. This is the beauty of having your director of the School of Music follow you around wherever you go, just in case you need a quick introduction. There you go. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out. This has just been amazing to be here for the very first time myself at the AMS-CMT joint meeting. And I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to move from the microphone, but you know, I'm a pacer. So I want to start by just kind of giving you an overview of what you're about to witness. I consider myself a performer, a curator that draws connections between culture and music. My work examines intersections between musicology and performance practice within the African diaspora. The title of today's lecture is a play on words of how Bridgetower flourished, a violinist bridge between past and future. I do want to thank also United Airlines for not losing my baggage for the first time this year in a flight. So I would like to start with an excerpt of the inaugural work for my commissioning project, Forge with George. It is entitled holistically The Bridgetower, and it is in 3 movements. This first movement is called If Only, a fantasy based on poet laureate Rita Dove's The Bridgetower for singing, speaking, solo violin. This was written in 2017. So again, for singing, speaking, solo violin, wish me luck. All right. If was at the beginning. If was at the beginning. If he hasn't been dark. Place in that remarkable face. If he had not been so gifted, so young, genius with no time to grow up. If he had not grown up undistinguished to an obscure old age, if the piece had truly been, as Kreutzer exclaimed, even after our man had played it. And for years, no one else was able to follow, so that the composer's fury would have raged for naught. Okay. That was by David Wallace, who is the string area chair at Berklee College of Music. And he did me a great favor of combining a lot of American roots inside of this story of George Bridgetower. So I gave you a little snippet of that piece. George Augustus Bridgetower is best known as the original dedicatee of one of Ludwig van Beethoven's most difficult works, the Sonata for Piano and Violin Op.47. Premiered by both musicians in 1803 in Vienna's Ogertin Theater, Bridgetower's immense compositional skills were exposed that day. Reading the unfinished manuscript over Beethoven's shoulder, did you hear what I said? And improvising virtuosic passages during the performance. Historic record tells us Beethoven rededicated the piece to French violinist Rudolf Kreutzer, who he never knew. That was due to an argument with Bridgetower over a woman. Tying in some musical examples, I'd like to share with you a bit about his family, his life under the royal patronage system, his teachers, colleagues, his relationship to society as an Afro-European, and yes, his turmoiled friendship with Beethoven. There has been attention toward the Bridgetower story, albeit somewhat masked. It was included in the Beethoven movie Immortal Beloved in 1990. I won't tell you that I saw it then. But it wasn't until 2016 that I invested time in Rita Dove's 2009 book called Sonata Mulatica, which brought the story of virtuoso George Bridgetower to life. Since then, I had been investigating the possibilities of repertoire. Each piece has its own genesis and connection to people, to culture, and to history. I try to find these connections through community engagement, teaching, outreach, and programming, something I like to call global grassroots. And this is what manifested my commissioning project, Forge with George. While many times a lecture like this lends itself to sharing a biographical chronology, I've been most interested in George Bridgetower's associates, as there are many. As Goethe stated, "Tell me with whom you associate, and I will tell you who you are." The idea of intentionally diversifying the past has been a relatively new one for me. I've been led by many pioneers in the last 30 years of my career to seek a more inclusive look at the music in which I have chosen to perform, some of which are in this room right now. Thank you so much. This last 6-year research period focused on George Bridgetower has clarified my vision to diversify the past in order to strengthen the future. George Bridgetower had an extraordinary career, yet in a time when fetishes were trendy, he was labeled a prodigy his entire life, designated as a mulatto violinist, and was marketed as the African prince. There's much more information to discover about his elaborate career, and it is my hope ultimately to discover his violin concerto and oratorio, as well as gather more details about his career post-patronage. So I'll share a little bit about those things and play a little music for you. By any day standards, George Bridgetower was a greatly accomplished musician. However, history would suggest his only achievement is his association with Beethoven and his Ninth Violin Sonata. Carl Czerny's review of that concert, who was a student then of Beethoven, received undue negative attention by referencing Bridgetower's playing as so crazy the audience laughed. See if I can do that for you. Now I know why my DMA advisor told me not to play that in my lecture recital. It's my final recital. Okay, but I gave it a go. Let's see. George Bridgetower was born in 1779 in Biała, Poland. According to Bridgetower's passport, he identified as mulatto and was listed as medium height, swarthy complexion, dark brown hair, brown eyes, and a rather broad nose. His father's escape from slavery led to George's solo debut in Paris at the age of 9 years old at the Concert Spirituel. The Concert Spirituel was one of the first concert series and attracted the world's leading concert artists. Thank you. George Bridgetower was an acclaimed touring artist in Europe. And after his iconic 1803 visit with Bridgetower in Vienna, Bridgetower returned to London to perform and teach. He earned a Bachelor of Music degree from Cambridge University and also actively performed with the Philharmonic Society of London. Thank you. George's great fame as a violinist can be attributed to many people, but namely his father. John Friedrich Bridgetower was born in Bridgetown, Barbados. He likely adapted the name Bridgetower from the seaport town, Bridgetown. Bridgetown is the capital of Barbados and its largest city. A significant portion of the slave trade from Africa passed through Bridgetown. To protect himself from returning to the helms of slavery, John Bridgetower had many aliases. He often identified himself as Friedrich August Bridgetower, as well as the Abyssinian prince. John Bridgetower found his way to Europe by way of escape, probably around the year 1770. How he managed to get there remains a mystery, but it was then he began a life that he hoped would end his family's association with the cruelty of slavery. In 1778, Bridgetower was a servant to Prince Radziwill in Biała, Poland. Here, he likely met his wife, Mary Ann Sovinki. It is unclear whether she was a servant there also, so some sources suggest she was royalty herself, the daughter of a Polish count. I don't have any pictures of her yet. I look forward to gaining some of those. Mary Ann Sovinki lived the majority of her life in Dresden, Germany, recovering from illness. George Bridgetower was born a year after they met in 1779 and baptized Hieronimo Hippolito Augusto, named after John Bridgetower's employer. John Friedrich had 2 sons, the eldest a young brother also named Friedrich, who they called Friedrich II. He was a talented cellist in his own right and played the cello primarily to support himself and his mother living in Dresden, Germany, but performed at least twice with his brother George. Of particular significance was a performance in May 1805 at the concerts at Hanover Square, which were sponsored by musical impresario Johann Peter Salomon. I was just at Hanover Square last month, so I can't help but tell you that. Okay, it was awesome. The concert featured Beethoven's Septet, Opus 20, that included his brother George and the famed bassist Domenico Dragonetti. It was written in 1800, and this was very likely the London premiere of the work. In 1780, John Friedrich, with George in tow, journeyed to Vienna, and with his clever ways became a personal page to none other than Prince Nicholas Esterhazy at his country estate in Eisenstadt. This was indeed during this time Joseph Haydn was currently court composer. Within the next 10 years, John Bridgetower toured his son throughout Poland, Austria, France, Italy, and England to build his notoriety. Without any personal wealth, Father Bridgetower sought out ways to further the career of his prodigy son. Upon his first years in London, he dressed in Turkish clothing as the Abyssinian prince. John Bridgetower believed that grooming George Bridgetower as a Turkish violin prodigy would set him apart and build his reputation. As was the fascination of the day, anything culturally non-European was considered exotic and generally labeled as Turkish. Though John Friedrich's dress was considered outrageous, it wasn't unusual. Turkey's Ottoman Empire was quite influential in Southeastern Europe in both the military and cultural areas. Who do we know that composed pieces in this way? Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, right? English writer Jane Girdham describes the popularity of the Turkish Janissary Band in her book, Black Musicians in England. While some Black musicians became professional soloists, others joined military bands. In the last decade of the 18th century, these musicians were distinguished by their skin color and elaborate costumes and playing Turkish instruments. To give you an idea of what John Friedrich was likely wearing includes the salvar, which are the trousers, the kaftan, the long robe, and sarik on the head, the yemeni on the feet. As well, all the 18th century guard bands in England employed Black percussion players who originated from the West Indies. They also dressed similarly to the Turkish military bands. This is a picture last month. I was at the National Portrait Gallery, and I was able to look at the Tudors exhibit, and this picture struck me in relationship to what potentially Mr. John Friedrich Bridgetower, his position or posture, if you will, toward the Queen, Charlotte, at that time. John Friedrich was clearly the catalyst in building George's career. However, his relationship with his son, George, escalated, and purported physical abuse brought the father's control over his son to an abrupt end. The Prince of Wales ordered the father into exile and patronized young Bridgetower for nearly a decade. Patronage didn't always manifest itself in dollars and cents, and Bridgetower's lifestyle became royal by the help of many. His primary patron was the Prince of Wales, who would become King George IV. In the height of his career, Bridgetower maintained close associates with some of the leading musicians of his time, and it is the Prince of Wales that is responsible for Bridgetower's success. In addition to performances with the Prince Regent's Band, and I'll show you later, I just found accounts from the Royal Archives that show that George Bridgetower was being paid to play in the Royal Band, which of course, from my perspective, suggests that he was not considered so much of a slave, but a servant in the royal in royalty. That's what happens when you ad lib. In addition to performances with so many of his concerts, including several times at Paris's Concert Spirituel, he was a regular performer at London's Drury Lane Theatre, Windsor Castle, Brighton Pavilion, and the Pump Rooms at Bath. Between 1791 and 1792, Joseph Haydn and George Bridgetower performed together for the concerts at Hanover Square. He also was part of the 1791 Handel commemoration held in Westminster Abbey. In 1807, Bridgetower became a member of the Royal Society of Musicians, the oldest music-related charity in Great Britain, founded in 1738. Bridgetower also had the honor of becoming voted in as a member of the esteemed Philharmonic Society of London, later named the Royal Philharmonic Society. Bridgetower was one of the 30 original members in 1813. Notable works that the Society commissioned during Bridgetower's time were Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and Mendelssohn's Italian Symphony. With a career this dynamic, there was not a shortage of people in the royal court anxious to hear the young boy perform. Charlotte Louise Henriette Papendick was no exception. She was the attendant for Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III. Miss Papendick gives clarity to many questions in the Bridgetower story in her memoir, The Court and Private Life in the Time of Queen Charlotte, written in 1833. It reflects upon Mrs. Papendick's life while living in Windsor Castle. It also appears John Friedrich, again with George in tow, wandered to the palace often, and though the court eventually became quite irritated with him, they were fascinated enough by the talents of the boy, they invited them in. George must have been about 10 years old during this time. I'd like to read you a couple entries, short entries from her memoir. This is how the first time they met. I hope that I will not fall into my English faux accent. About this time, an adventurer of the name of Bridgetower, a Black, came to Windsor with a view of introducing his son, a most prepossessing lad of 10 or 12 years old, and a fine violin player. He was commanded by their majesties to perform at the lodge, when he played a concerto of Viati's and a quartet of Haydn's, whose pupil he called himself. Both father and son pleased greatly, the one for his talent and modest bearing, the other for his fascinating manner, elegance, expertness in all language, beauty of person, and taste in dress. He seemed to win the good opinion of everyone and was courted by all and entreated to join the society. Miss Papendick later speaks of John Friedrich's last visit before he was exiled by the Prince of Wales. On my return home, I told John Bridgetower never again to ask to lend money, for we had already done what we could. He, of course, was not well pleased with this speech, but I began, as did many others, not to be altogether satisfied with his conduct. And another Papendick writing resounds about Bridgetower. The young performer played to perfection. Bridgetower had always been remarkable for his elegant and bold manner of drawing the bow. What a compliment. Wish people would say that to me. Despite their misgivings about John Friedrich, their adoration for young Bridgetower was devout, and Windsor was grateful to have him perform before them. It was his patronage with the prince that exposed him to some of the greatest teachers of his time. It was also under the Prince of Wales, George IV, that George Bridgetower studied with violin with French violinist Francois Hippolyte Bartholomew. In 1821, the king then appointed Thomas Atwood, organist, to his private chapel at Brighton. It was there that he taught young Bridgetower composition and keyboard. It was Italian violinist Giovanni Battista Viati that was Bridgetower's primary violin teacher, and Bridgetower undoubtedly premiered many of Viati's violin concerti. Viati's works were a staple in his repertoire, and the two apparently had a wonderful relationship. Viati is known as the teacher of both Pierre Rode and Pierre Baillot. Along with Rudolf Kreutzer, they were all teachers at the Paris Conservatory. Considered the founder of the French violin school, Viati is associated with technique development through the modern Tourte bow. It should be noted that Bridgetower played on a 1715 Stradivarius. In my search, I went to many fine violin shops throughout the world to ask about the 1715 collection, and there are 14 of these. I think Cho Liang Lin has one, and a few other, Nadja Solano Sonnenberg had one for a time. but I was not able to track down historically which one that Bridgetower owned. And I am going to keep working and looking for that one. But 14 is not too bad. I'm going to keep searching for that. Found in the Letters of Samuel Wesley by Philip Oleson, it was English organist Samuel Wesley that left the following appreciation of Bridgetower. George Bridgetower, who they used to dominate the African prince, is just to be ranked with the very first masters of the violin. He practiced much with the celebrated Viotti and imbibed primarily of his bold and spirited style of execution. It is in this area of my talk that I'd like to introduce kind of a curated recital mini that I would do performatively in regards to my work on Bridgetower. Let's talk about a little bit about his collegial relationship with Samuel Wesley. We know him from the big family of John and Charles Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church and great hymnist as well. Samuel Wesley is particular significance to Bridgetower's contribution because of his interest in Bach. Samuel Wesley was a well-known Bach enthusiast, a prodigy of the violin and organ, and was an accomplished composer. He was the son of Charles and nephew of John Wesley, again, leaders of the Methodist Church. During the years 1797 and 1815, Wesley and Bridgetower corresponded, leaving 10 known letters written by Wesley to Bridgetower. One letter relays Wesley's interest in Bridgetower's Bach performance and requests him to perform the Bach solo sonatas and partitas at his brother's home. It reads, "My dear sir, I beg to leave to inform you that I shall be happy to know when and where I may make good promise to my brother of hearing you execute the exquisite solos of Bach. If you name an evening within a week hence, I will make it convenient to attend your appointment. Upon obtaining your answer, will immediately acquaint my brother. Most truly yours, Wesley, July 1814. Again, in 1803, German music publisher Nicholas Simrock printed the complete publication of the Bach works. Wesley sends another letter to Bridgetower regarding the acquisition in September of 1814. And he says, "Had I not the pleasure of lending you Bach's violin solos some time since? I had been searching diligently through hitherto in vain, but I shall be delighted to know that they are in your safe keeping." Samuel Wesley's letters are equally entertaining and important references. For instance, many historians have reported the first documented performance of Bach's magnificent chaconne was by violinist Ferdinand David in Leipzig, February 1840. According to Samuel Wesley's letter to a friend and music publisher Vincent Novello, the first public performance of the chaconne was of George Bridgetower in 1814. Part of that letter reads, "Among the tunes played by Bridgetower were a trio of Mozart, two of Purcell, and one of J.S. Bach, another arranged from the first prelude and fugue of the second book, the chaconne, and the fugue in C from the sonatas and partitas." On February 19, 1797, Samuel Wesley had completed his first and only work for piano and violin, entitled Duet for Piano and Violin. He composes this piece 4 days before he sent a letter to Bridgetower requesting his presence at his music reading party. I believe that in some way he was thinking of Bridgetower, and he wrote it for Johann Salomon. That dedication is on the manuscript but it is very interesting that he finished up the sonata, then invited Wesley to join him. I'd like to play for you a sample of that work and follow it by a reimagining of my Forge with George project by Jesse Cox. Let's just read the program note from Jesse Cox. Jesse Cox is a composer at Columbia University right now, and he speaks to his piece, "The Fiddle is for Diggin'." And he says, "The fiddle is full of cultural codes. It speaks many different languages. In this piece, Nicole is listening to the fiddle, to all the ancestors talking to us through the information. She's traveling through time and space. In this sense, we are listening to the future, to what could be." So this is him grappling with his ancestors, our ancestors, and what could be, and this relationship of Bach as well, and Bridgetower, and these conversations. So I'm going to play for you a little bit of his first sonata, first movement of Samuel Wesley's sonata, and then follow that with the Jesse Cox. By the way, this is Faith DeBow on piano. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. As soon as I start the other, you can walk off if you like, okay? Thank you so much. Just going to give an overview of exoticism in Georgian life. It is impossible to ignore the layered context regarding young Bridgetower's namesake, nicknamed the African Prince. The current George III opposed the abolitionist movement and transported nearly 2 million slaves out of Africa to British colonies. Many musicians blindly accommodated the ways of society. The English songwriter Charles Dibdin, a prolific writer of songs for the theater, was an example. While a very successful songwriter and musical composer, he also presented Negro impersonations, accommodating an aristocratic taste. Billy Blackwaters, who was a well-known London beggar and was elected king of beggars. The one and only Ignatius Sancho, who was an Afro-British composer and violinist, was the only British person of African heritage known to be able to vote for members of parliament in Westminster. And as we know, that was hard for everybody and women, and was the first Black composer in history to publish his music. Angelo Solomon arrived in Austria as a slave from Western Africa. He was owned by popular arts patron Prince Labkovitz, who was widely known for his patronage of Beethoven and Haydn. After a performance before the royal family, the prince writes George a poem in a way to romance the young boy. The words also sum up the prejudice he faced. It reads, on the musical phenomenon, while sable Afrique's royal son through the sweet maze of music run, and by his mingled powers of play made majesty or grave or gay. The mighty monarch was beguiled and owned a master in a child. The text of this poem indicates that the possession of a dark-skinned African child came with an idealistic fascination. To own a Moor was a status symbol and was a conquest of great significance. So, what happened on that great day? I just want to briefly go through that with you. It is probable that Beethoven would have never noticed Bridgetower had it not been for his status as exotic. This is a picture of the original manuscript. His great friend Beethoven dedicates his Opus 47 sonata to George Bridgetower with these words: the mulatto sonata composed for the mulatto Bridgetower, my great mulatto composer and lunatic. How many mulattoes was that? And a lunatic. Of great intrigue to me is the friendship between Beethoven and Bridgetower. Bridgetower arrived in Vienna from Dresden after visiting his ailing mother in July 1802. He was well equipped with letters of introduction from London and Dresden. It was all because of Prince Lichnowsky, who introduced Bridgetower to Beethoven at a gathering that the two became fast friends. So what about that famous day? It was 8 a.m. at the beautiful Ogerton. The concert was sponsored by Prince Lichnowsky and was well attended by an esteemed group of patrons and supporters of Beethoven. Some in attendance were Prince Esterhazy, Prince Labkovitz, and Count Razumovsky. Beethoven's friend and student, Ferdinand Ries, tells us that Beethoven called him at 4:30 in the morning and asked him to copy the violin part of the first movement. The piano part was just sketched. The second movement variations were incomplete. In my mind, this is where a lot of the other flourishes occurred that we don't have just yet. And Bridgetower had to play his violin part from an illegible manuscript and over the composer's shoulder. On top of that, Beethoven grabbed the last movement from the finale of another piece, the Sonata for Piano and Violin, Opus 30, number 1. The idea that Beethoven stopped working on the Eroica Symphony to finish the Opus 47 violin sonata speaks to the magnitude of this piece. As for Bridgetower's contribution to the sonata, Beethoven writes, my sonata for piano and violin, dedicated to George Bridgetower, is a success. I had barely finished it by the first performance, though, and so George had to read his part over my shoulder as I played the piano. He even changed some parts, which I gratefully admit he improved. I have gifted him this tuning fork as a token of my admiration. Okay. But we know that that tuning fork had a nice journey, right? With Berlioz, in the hands of Berlioz and many other composers. Well, what parts did he change? I'm still trying to uncover all of them, but I played a bit for you. I believe much more than we know, being the piece wasn't finished. But every source that discusses Bridgetower mentions this particular flourish, that he improvised on the violin during the premiere. This flourish was an imitation of Beethoven's arpeggio in the piano part. Thanks to the editor John Thirlwall, who interviewed Bridgetower later in his life for preserving this flourish that Bridgetower had written on his score. Bridgetower's ability to actualize the arpeggio on the spot gives us a glimpse into his capability on the violin. Though, I want to talk a little bit about why they separated. Though we know Beethoven was no stranger to confrontation, I believe the argument came on the heels of Beethoven's already intense feelings about Napoleon. I put together a recent theory about this argument. I came across a letter from Beethoven to Bridgetower regarding a visit to Countess Josephine Brunswick von Diem's home. This is the same woman historians presume. Should I say this in front of historians? Sometimes we think it's Brentano, but some believe that it was this Countess Diem that was the immortal beloved. The letter reads, "Go, my dear Bridgetower," this is from Beethoven, "go, my dear Bridgetower, at about noon today to Count Diem's. That is to say, to the same house where we both were the day before yesterday. Those people would probably like to hear you play one of your compositions. Until then, I look forward to seeing you today, and in the meantime, I take pleasure in merely remembering you, your friend, Beethoven." This is found in Alexander Thayer's Life of Beethoven, Volume 2. If this indeed is Beethoven's immortal beloved, it is probable and unfortunate that Countess Diem is the alleged woman Bridgetower insulted and thus ended his friendship with Beethoven. Just weeks later, Beethoven, true to form, states that Bridgetower has no manners. At 26, a young man should know his place. He has dared to insult a woman with whom he knows I am in love. I will never speak to him again, and I have already renamed his sonata after another great violinist, Rudolf Kreutzer. And this is the 1805 manuscript, published, first edition, published by Simrock. I'm going to close out just with an quick overview of some of the music that I found in the library, then play one of his pieces for you that I found has caused a lot of great and challenging conversation, in fact. Bridgetower may have been a master violinist nicknamed the African Prince, but George Bridgetower was not merely a spectator when it came to music. His exposure to Joseph Haydn and attaining a Bachelor of Music degree from Cambridge University offered him the knowledge to be versed in many areas of music, including composition. And let us not forget that he studied with Thomas Attwood. Thomas Attwood was one of the first professors at the Royal Academy in 1823, and so it is possible that Bridgetower could have been one of the founding members, student members of the Royal Academy as well. To date, I possess 4 of his pieces. Again, my ultimate goal is to find his violin concerto, which I newly found, I thought it was 1802, but it is found in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, that his first performance was in 1799 of his violin concerto. So it is somewhere out there, and he has performed it quite a few times. I'm working with Dr. Victoria Avery, one of the curators of the Fitzwilliam Museum, to locate all of this. And the Fitzwilliam Museum is connected to Cambridge University to locate more of his pieces. First one is his graduation work. It's an anthem, which I call kind of a mini oratorio, so strings and voice. And it was written in 1811, titled By Faith Sublime, Fair Passiflora, steering her pilgrimage along the Vale of Tears. Again, the text is by Mrs. F.A. Rowden. I'm currently hunting for this piece as well. These are 4 of his works that were published as he was under the patronage of the king. The Jubilee, which is a theme and variations based on God Save the King. Henry a Ballad is a art song for voice and piano. Diatonica Armonica, which is an etude book, and the Cherubini Overture to Lodoiska. We'll talk a little bit about this Diatonica Armonica. I'd like Faith to play that for you just a little bit. This work consists of 41 etudes for the piano dedicated to his students and was published by London publisher Birchall in 1812. I find this piece particularly special because in the preface he writes something to his students. A portion states, "In presenting the following little work to the public, I'm influenced by a desire of offering to students in music that which may unite instruction and amusement, the former as necessary for their improvement, and the latter an inducement to the frequent practice of the style of playing on the pianoforte." Here's an excerpt of the G major etude, Polonaise. Very nice. I want to call up my friends to play an example of the Jubilee. Jubilee Variations on Rule Britannia and God Save the King. This is originally for flute, 2 violins, viola, and violoncello, composed in commemoration of King George III's Jubilee ceremony, Golden Jubilee ceremony in 1809. I'm going to show you a little bit also, which is interesting. This is the original page, and the first page, the first violin part. Inside, this is the Royal Highness Book of Accounts, in which here in April 1809 states when he was paid regularly for being in the royal band and composing pieces for the royal band, right? So this piece was written in October 1809. In my most recent talks when I was in the Royal Academy, I played a little excerpt of this, a recording of this, and their hearts dropped. You know, the problematic political challenges around this tune, this piece of music, historically and inside of the monarchy is still a problem and hard to discuss for many. So from this, I started a project called the Jubilee Project, in which to open up conversations around this. So I have performers from all over the world perform this work, and then afterward have discussions about the circumstances around it, the politics around it. So this is probably one of the first times we're having this performance. I did kind of a so-so job arranging this for 4 violins. So without further ado, this is Jubilee by George Bridgetower. The Denver air is making my hairs fall out, people. I don't know what that is. By the way, speaking of which, this is Philip Ledgerward, who I met at Texas Tech doing my doctorate. He is now here, a wonderful violin teacher in Denver. Joy Yamaguchi, who I also met at a music festival years ago, who is now also getting her doctorate at Boulder, candidate, and lives here in Colorado. And let me see if I can do this. Phil Feature, who teaches at University of Metropolitan State University. And the reason I stutter about Phil is because I had another friend playing, and he was wonderful to step in because he got injured. So it's not that I forgot him or anything. Thank you. It was in February 29th, 1860, George Bridgetower died in Peckham, London, at number 8 Victory Cottages, Montpelier Road, a house long since demolished. According to Bridgetower's estate's records, Bridgetower possessed a cello, a viola, 2 violins by Antonius Stradivarius, a violin by Amati, and a bow by Betts. His tombstone reads, George Polgreen Bridgetower, Esquire, died the 29th of February, 1860, 78 years old, and is buried in London's Kensal Green Cemetery. The pleasure of visiting that place, that cemetery, and unfortunately it was molded at the time. This is how it looks, but it was all guarded off at the time. This research proposes 4 recommendations regarding the sonata for piano and violin, as well as issues around George Bridgetower's life. As suggested by one of my mentors, Dr. Dominique René Delerma, it is crucial to revisit the actual events of the past and perform these discoveries. Dr. Delerma suggests that violinists should apply George Bridgetower's improvisation into the performance. This may well be the only documented traits that are specific to Bridgetower. That was then. Now we have 4 pieces at our fingertips. As well, they demonstrate Bridgetower's skill level and allow to preserve the Urtext performance. And the Kreutzer nickname should be in connection with Bridgetower as the dedicatee of the sonata. Bridgetower, in his interview with editor John Thirlwall, avowed that his legacy shall not be forgotten. And the question is always, who gets remembered and why? There's always that little dabble, that little balance point of a lecture recital, like, should I play more music or talk more? I believed that I needed to speak on the things that I found about this man. We can learn a great deal from his journeys and those collaborations along the way. George Bridgetower laid a strong foundation for the next generation of all artists all over the world, some of which are Samuel Coleridge Taylor, American composer Will Marion Cook, composer Harry Burleigh, Clarence Cameron White, Nathaniel Dett, and on and on. Inclusivity comes from actively understanding your surroundings, embracing our history, and being intentional about how it relates to ourselves and the rest of the world. Beethoven and Bridgetower transcended the sonata for piano and violin, Opus 47. Beethoven had the open-mindedness to befriend Mr. Bridgetower when many didn't even care to see him as a man. The documentation of the past is imperative to the survival of historical truth, and it is the responsibility of artist scholars to trace those that have maintained records of their life experiences and those with which they interacted. My search continues. Thank you so much for hearing me today. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. If you have any questions for me, please don't ask. No. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to engage. Yes.
So, and this is, I am sure making notes, but I have in like the back of my head some memory that at some point he played for Thomas Jefferson. And so I'm wondering if that's true, and if he did Thomas Jefferson comment on it at all?
That is a very interesting question. Thank you for that. And that is something that I'm very intrigued by as well, right? Because I'm very interested in that global interaction from the States. I spent so much time looking at enslaved fiddlers in America. And so Bridgetower is opening up literally a whole new world for me. And so, yes, I have also read that. Mostly, honestly, I read that in Rita Dove's book. She goes at length about that and will admittedly say that that book is fiction. So you kind of have to sift through that. There's also, because there is fact, she did go to England, she did do her research, but of course she's a poet and a wonderful writer. So there also, along those lines, I have seen evidence that he was at the premiere, maybe with Miss Fleming there somewhere. So who knows? But I'm still curious about that very much. And he had his own fiddlers, right? And it was known actually to bring his fiddlers with him if he traveled to Europe in some way. So I'm very curious about that. Maybe Dr. Mariani knows a little bit more about that for me. Yeah. Yes?
This is kind of a long question, but it is a question. I've been coming at some of this from a different perspective, and with the Beethoven people, since I do a lot of reception history, I've been looking at this, like, why do we call it Kreutzer? Because, we don't call it the Haydn Sonata or the Moses Brown Sonata. We don't usually call things after their dedicatee. So I've been looking into that. And when I was presenting this with the Beethoven people, Christina Ziegert of the Beethoven Archiv in Bonn, with the slide that you were showing, Composta, Grand Pazzo Compositore Melatico, Compositore, like Beethoven, we don't have any compositions of Bridgetower that we have now from before Beethoven met Bridgetower, but Beethoven says composer. He knew him as composer. It's very likely that at this concert at the Algarden, what was it? It was a Bridgetower benefit, so Beethoven Sonata was on it, but probably also Bridgetower's works. So Beethoven knew Bridgetower composition. So with all that in mind, what would you think about the idea that the flourishes actually made it into the final version of the sonata? That if we knew enough about Bridgetower's playing, that it's already right there?
I think that is a great idea. Fantastic idea. I think that's an amazing point you're making about the dedicatees. Now, certainly, Bridgetower was composing beforehand, and many of the programs that we have, these are mostly from what I found in researching from Josephine Wright in her articles about Bridgetower, but we have programs of him having written pieces, certainly at least close to a decade before the premiere of the sonata. So I agree wholeheartedly. I'm working on getting a modern and contemporary manuscript of these pieces, of the ones that you just saw that already were published by the king. The flourishes, so for me, the flourishes, having the flourish in would be incredible. However, I'd like to find more of those. I'd like to know that, because we don't know the whole story just yet. So just to put one is kind of just incomplete for me. But I think it's definitely something that could be put into the preface, into a critical edition for sure, So is there any Henley people here? Yes, Ben.
This is sort of related to this idea of the flourishes, just because I find it so fascinating that we have an idea of what musicians' own personal musical improvisatory styles were like. And so I was wondering, to what, if any degree, has historical performance practice influenced your work with Bridgetower, maybe in specific reference to his specific style? Since improvising on given melodies is very common at this time, and we actually have, at least in one case, what this looked like for him.
You're talking about in historical performance. Yeah. I think for me, I look at that flourish very closely in the sense of the French violin school, because he was so he basically was fully a member of that. Like he studied with Viotti very during the period in which the modern bowing was being created. Certain Kreutzer's etude book was being written at that time. Many etude books by Bayeux were coming about, and there are a lot of similarities in that. Certainly, also I connect the fact that he performed, and in my mind, premiered many of Viotti's violin concerti. So he had a clear understanding of what modern bow technique was. I mean, maybe more than a lot of, I mean, it's easy for me to say, but maybe more than a lot of violinists, performing violinists of the time, because a hands-on connection with him. And I have many, actually, letters stating his relationship with Fiati that come through that, the memoirs of Samuel Wesley, exactly. So I think I'm headed in your direction in terms of the question, but I do see great evidence that he was very, very educated in how the bow worked in terms of the French violin school. And so I think that that should be definitely noted and discussed in another paper of some sort, right? Yes.
Going along with this, because I'm fascinated by this idea of extemporation and improv in the early 19th century. And this might be long-winded, I apologize. I'm curious about, in the beginning of your talk, you spoke about how his performance of the Kreutzer was viewed as wild. Right? Or, in very inflected language. And I was curious because Paganini's performing around this time too. And I was wondering how that comparison is made, because we see this also in issues of Brahms's performances, Joachim's performances of Brahms and things like that. And also if there are other reviews of Bridgetower's performances and how he's viewed through a lens as an improviser, a composer, or a violinist.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. In fact, I'd love to ask you what you think about that. But more that is exactly, you have pinpointed exactly what makes me curious. That was the people laughed. I mean, not only that Charity said it was crazy playing, but that people laughed, right? So do we get into the race issue there? Do we get into the fact that he has a lineage from the Caribbean? Was his family singing to him songs of the Caribbean as he was born earlier in Poland, when, you know what I mean? And all these things, and how does that come into play? Was the fact that it was sight reading the darn thing, and it's one of the hardest violin sonatas that existed. So you know what I mean? All of that comes into play for sure. But I have talked to linguists about that to actually truly interpret what it is that word crazy can mean culturally, politically, societally in that period of time. And even with Beethoven calling him a lunatic, right, endearingly. But why are you saying that? Anyway. But yes. So yeah, there's that is a great fascination of mine and those words, and I'd love to continue that conversation. But I'm looking forward to digging into why also we have to consider Czerny was 12 when he said it. So let's think about that one too. So how is he saying crazy, right? Crazy, so that's another interpretation there, possibly. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for that beautiful lecture recital. You mentioned how the young Bridgetower had performed in Turkish clothing. So I wondered if maybe that influenced his musical style with the whole European vogue for the alla turca sound. Because some of those flourishes could almost be like fake Janissary music, Turkish style flourishes, a little bit like Mozart's pretend imitations of Turkish virtuosity.
Man, I gotta hang out with you guys more often. Well, that would be so fascinating and certainly an influence, just like I said, with the sociocultural aspect of it. We have to remember that his father, his grandfather were from the Caribbean. And so how does that play a role in who he is as a human being in the world? But at that point, he was patronized by the king. So they had made him into an Englishman at that point, right? So, and whatever that means, we're still influenced by our past and our identity from the past. But it seems to me that he had a not so great relationship with his father. So it seems to me that he would want to separate anything that reminded him of that. However, I'm intrigued greatly by what you're saying, but he in the premiere he was not wearing those clothes. He was wearing royal attire, if you will. So Yeah. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for everybody for engaging me. This has been a wonderful pleasure. Appreciate it.